The war in Europe ended not with silence, but with movement. In the first warm days after Germany's surrender in May 1945, columns of American vehicles still rolled along shattered roads, engines echoing through towns that had already changed flags too many times. For General George S. Patton, victory did not feel like an ending. It felt like an interruption. He remained in Germany, commander of the Third Army, surrounded by maps, reports, and unfinished thoughts about a war that had stopped before he believed it was truly settled. Patton had lived for motion, from North Africa to Sicily, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the lightning advance across France. Speed had been his weapon and his identity. He believed momentum saved lives, that hesitation was the deadliest enemy of all. When the guns fell silent, that rhythm vanished. Officers noticed it immediately. Patton still rose early, still rode out to inspect units, still spoke as if another offensive were imminent. The world around him had slowed. He had not. In headquarters buildings that still smelled of smoke and damp plaster, Patton spoke openly about what came next. He had no patience for the idea that the war was finished simply because Berlin had fallen. To him, the real threat lay to the east. The Soviet Union, now an ally by necessity, had occupied vast stretches of Eastern Europe. Patton saw their armies not as partners, but as future enemies, disciplined, ruthless, and already positioned. He told his staff that history would judge the moment harshly if the Western allies allowed Stalin to keep what his armies had seized. These views were not private musings. Patton expressed them bluntly, sometimes recklessly, in conversations with journalists, officers, and visiting dignitaries. He praised German military efficiency while condemning Nazi leadership, a distinction he believed was obvious, but which landed poorly in a world still counting the dead. He argued that former German officers should be retained to help administer occupied territory and maintain order. To Patton, they were professionals who understood Europe and hated communism. To many others, this sounded dangerously close to rehabilitation of a defeated enemy. The American occupation of Germany was a fragile enterprise, and Patton was an awkward figure at its center. His Third Army now governed millions of civilians across Bavaria. Refugees crowded roads and camps. Displaced persons searched for families who no longer existed. Former Nazis attempted to disappear into the chaos. Patton viewed denazification policies as impractical and counterproductive. He complained that purging every former party member would leave no one capable of running a city, a factory, or a rail line. When he spoke of these frustrations, his language was often unguarded. His metaphors crude, his tone dismissive. His superiors listened with increasing concern. Dwight D. Eisenhower, now Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had known Patton for decades. He respected his battlefield brilliance and understood his temperament better than most. Eisenhower also understood politics. The alliance with the Soviet Union was already strained, and public opinion at home was shifting toward peace, stability, and moral clarity. Patton's comments threatened all three. In private, Eisenhower warned him to be careful. Patton nodded, agreed, and then continued as before. He had never mastered restraint, and he had never believed that silence was a virtue. The press sensed the tension and followed him closely. Interviews that Patton treated as casual conversations became headlines that reverberated back to Washington. Each quote sharpened the image of a general who could not adapt to peace. Despite the controversies, Patton remained popular among his soldiers. They had followed him through some of the hardest fighting of the war and credited his aggressive leadership with their survival. He visited units frequently, speaking with enlisted men, asking about rations, equipment, and home. They saw not a political liability, but a commander who still cared deeply about the army he had forged. That loyalty, however, could not shield him from scrutiny at higher levels. By late summer 1945, pressure mounted. Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to lead the 15th Army, a largely administrative and historical unit tasked with compiling records of the war. It was a quiet post, far from the action, stripped of operational authority. To Patton, it felt like exile. He accepted the reassignment outwardly, but friends noticed the change. His energy remained, but it now had nowhere to go. He filled his days with writing, dictation, and long drives through the countryside. Bavaria in autumn was peaceful in a way Europe had not been for years. Forests glowed with color, villages rebuilt slowly, and farmers returned to fields once torn apart by armor. Patton admired the landscape, often remarking on its beauty. But the calm unsettled him. He had spent his life preparing for war and commanding men in it. Peace offered no equivalent challenge. In letters home, Patton spoke of his desire to return to the United States. He dreamed of writing, lecturing, perhaps even running for office. He also expressed frustration, a sense that his contributions were being minimized, that history might remember him as a problem rather than a victor. Those close to him sensed a man caught between pride and bitterness, unable to reconcile his wartime identity with the world emerging around him. At the same time, Patton remained physically active. He hunted, rode horses, and insisted on driving himself whenever possible. The roads of occupied Germany were improving, but they were still dangerous, crowded with military vehicles, civilian traffic, and the remnants of war. Patton dismissed concerns. He had survived shell fire, air attacks, and near misses that should have killed him many times over. A drive through the countryside seemed harmless by comparison. In November 1945, Patton learned that he would soon return to the United States. The date was not fixed, but the expectation lifted his spirits. He spoke of seeing family, of starting anew. Yet even as plans formed, he remained restless. The war, he believed, had ended unfinished. The peace, he feared, was being mishandled. History, in his view, was slipping in the wrong direction, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The general who had raced across Europe now found himself waiting for orders, waiting for passage home, waiting for a future that no longer required his particular genius. The roads were quiet, the maps folded, the enemy defeated but unresolved. Patton did not know that his time in Germany was nearly over, or that the last journey of his life would not be across an ocean, but along an ordinary road on an ordinary morning, in a land he believed should never have been allowed to rest. The war had spared him when death seemed inevitable. Peace, slow and unremarkable, was about to test him in a way no battlefield ever had. The peace that settled over Europe in 1945 was uneasy, layered with suspicion and unfinished business. For George S. Patton, it was not peace at all, but a pause filled with irritations, arguments, and a growing sense of isolation. The armies had stopped fighting, yet the struggle over memory, responsibility, and power had only begun. Patton found himself increasingly at odds with the direction the war's victors were taking, and his reputation, once defined by triumph, became entangled with controversy. Patton's removal from command of the Third Army marked a turning point that many inside the military understood, but few spoke about openly. He had not been dismissed for incompetence or failure in battle. His record in combat was extraordinary. Instead, he was sidelined because his words no longer matched the needs of the moment. The United States wanted stability in Germany, reconciliation at home, and a careful balance with the Soviet Union abroad. Patton wanted clarity, punishment for what he saw as weakness, and preparation for the next inevitable war. The general made little effort to soften his views. He spoke with the same bluntness in peace that he had in war. His remarks about denazification continued to draw criticism. Patton argued that the policy was being enforced mechanically, without understanding the reality of German society. Millions had joined the Nazi Party out of necessity, fear, or career survival, not ideological zeal. He believed that removing all of them from public life would paralyze the country and create resentment that would only benefit communism. These opinions were shared privately by some officers and administrators, but Patton voiced them publicly. He compared the Nazi Party to American political machines, a statement that outraged many listeners and was widely reported. In a world still reeling from the discovery of concentration camps and mass graves, such comparisons sounded tone-deaf at best and morally offensive at worst. The nuance Patton believed he was expressing was lost in the echo of his words. His critics grew louder. Journalists who once celebrated his victories now portrayed him as reckless and outdated. Political leaders in Washington worried that Patton had become a liability, a symbol of militarism at a moment when the nation wanted reassurance. Even fellow generals, men who had admired his courage under fire, began to distance themselves. Patton noticed the change. Invitations dwindled. Conversations grew cautious. He remained a famous name, but no longer a trusted voice. Eisenhower found himself in an impossible position. He owed much of the Allied success in Europe to Patton's leadership. He also knew that defending Patton publicly would undermine Allied unity and his own authority. Their relationship, once marked by mutual respect and private candor, became strained. Eisenhower continued to treat Patton with courtesy, but the closeness was gone. Patton, who valued loyalty above all else, felt the loss deeply. The 15th Army assignment was meant to remove Patton from the spotlight without humiliating him. Officially, it was an important historical mission, tasked with studying the war's lessons. Unofficially, it kept him out of operational command and away from reporters. Patton understood this immediately. He carried out his duties conscientiously, but there was no disguising his frustration. He had commanded hundreds of thousands of men in battle. Now he supervised historians and clerks. This enforced quiet gave Patton time to reflect, and reflection did not bring peace. He wrote extensively, filling journals with thoughts about history, fate, and his own place within both. He believed firmly that he had lived before, that he had been a warrior in other ages, always fighting the same eternal struggle. War, to Patton, was not an aberration, but a constant of human existence. The idea that the world could simply move on without acknowledging this truth felt dishonest to him. At the same time, Patton sensed that his public image was hardening into something he could not control. To some Americans, he was a hero unfairly punished for telling uncomfortable truths. To others, he was a dangerous anachronism, a man whose aggression belonged to a darker past. This division unsettled him. He had never fought for popularity, but he cared deeply about honor and legacy. The thought that history might remember him more for controversy than for victory gnawed at him. Despite these tensions, Patton remained under military discipline and continued to serve. He attended briefings, inspected facilities, and maintained the outward habits of command. Yet those around him noticed signs of weariness. His humor grew sharper, his patience thinner. Moments of introspection alternated with bursts of energy, as if he were trying to outrun a future that refused to take shape. The geopolitical landscape reinforced his anxieties. Reports from Eastern Europe described Soviet consolidation, political arrests, and the quiet installation of loyal regimes. Patton read these reports closely. To him, they confirmed everything he had warned about. He spoke openly about the likelihood of another war, this time against a former ally. Such statements alarmed policymakers who were struggling to demobilize millions of soldiers and reassure a war-weary public. At home, Patton's family watched events from a distance. Letters revealed both pride and concern. They encouraged him to come back, to step away from the turmoil and enjoy the peace he had helped secure. Patton wanted this too, but he felt unfinished. The war had defined him so completely that stepping out of its shadow seemed impossible. He was a general without a battlefield, a strategist without a campaign. By late 1945, Patton's future was uncertain. He was still on active duty, still wearing the stars of a full general, yet his influence had waned dramatically. The institution he had served his entire life no longer knew what to do with him. He existed in a kind of limbo, respected but restrained, famous but isolated. This unquiet peace weighed on him heavily. The battles he now fought were invisible, waged through words, reputations, and memory rather than tanks and troops. Patton had never learned how to retreat from such a fight. As winter approached in Germany, the air grew colder, the days shorter, and the roads slick with frost. Patton continued to move through this landscape, restless and unresolved, unaware that the next chapter of his life would not be written by speeches or controversies, but by a sudden, irreversible moment on a quiet road. The morning of December 9th, 1945, broke cold and clear over western Germany. Frost clung to the fields near Mannheim, turning the flat countryside pale beneath a low winter sun. For General George S. Patton, the day began without ceremony. He was in good spirits, looking forward to a pheasant hunt near Speyer, an outing meant to relieve the restlessness that had followed him since the war's end. It was an ordinary plan, the kind of small pleasure that seemed harmless after years of danger. Patton climbed into the back seat of his staff car shortly after leaving headquarters in Heidelberg. The vehicle was a 1938 Cadillac Series 75, large and heavy, driven by Private First Class Horace L. Woodring, an experienced Army driver. In the front passenger seat sat Major General Hobart Gay, Patton's longtime chief of staff and one of the few men who understood the general's moods. The road ahead was familiar, a well-traveled route through occupied territory where military and civilian traffic mixed uneasily. The drive began quietly. Patton talked about hunting, about horses, about his hope of returning home soon. He gazed out the window at the passing landscape. Fields still scarred by tank tracks and shell holes, now softened by frost. It was the kind of scene he had seen countless times during the war. Yet now it carried a strange stillness. No artillery thundered in the distance. No columns of armor rolled forward. The silence felt heavier than noise, As the Cadillac approached a railway crossing near the village of Ketch, traffic slowed. A U.S. Army truck, a 2.5-ton GMC, driven by Private Robert Thompson, was turning left from a side road. The truck was moving slowly, its canvas-covered rear loaded with supplies. Visibility was limited. The sun sat low in the sky, and the flat terrain offered little warning of vehicles entering the roadway. Woodring applied the brakes, but the distance closed too quickly. The Cadillac struck the rear of the truck at moderate speed. It was not a dramatic collision by wartime standards. There was no explosion, no fire, no chaos. The heavy Cadillac crumpled at the front. The truck lurched forward and stopped. Soldiers rushed toward the vehicles, startled but not panicked. Inside the Cadillac, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Woodring and Gay were injured but conscious. Patton was not. The force of the impact had thrown him forward violently. He'd been sitting upright, unrestrained, and his head snapped sharply. When Gay turned to speak to him, Patton did not respond. His body was slumped, his face pale, his eyes unfocused. Gay quickly realized the severity of the situation. He shouted for help and cradled Patton's head, trying to keep him still. Patton attempted to speak, managing only a few faint words. He complained of intense pain and said he could not feel his hands or feet. To a trained officer, the implication was terrifying. It suggested a severe injury to the spinal cord. An ambulance was summoned immediately. Patton was carefully lifted from the car and transported to the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg, one of the best-equipped military hospitals in the region. Doctors examined him upon arrival. X-rays revealed a fracture and dislocation of the third cervical vertebra. The diagnosis was grim. Patton was paralyzed from the neck down. Despite the seriousness of the injury, Patton remained conscious. He spoke calmly, even joking at moments, asking doctors how long it would take before he could get back on a horse. The medical staff avoided direct answers. They stabilized his neck with traction and began intensive care. News of the accident spread quickly through military channels, then beyond. Eisenhower was informed within hours. He visited Patton in the hospital, standing at the bedside of the man who had once been his most aggressive commander. Witnesses later recalled the meeting as quiet and heavy with unspoken emotion. Eisenhower spoke gently, offering reassurance without promises. Patton listened, his expression steady. But those close to him sensed that he understood the gravity of his condition. In the days that followed, Patton's health fluctuated. He suffered from pain, fever, and breathing difficulties. Immobilized, he became vulnerable to complications that even modern medicine struggled to control. Yet his mind remained sharp. He dictated letters, received visitors, and discussed military history with doctors and staff. He faced his paralysis with a mixture of stoicism and disbelief, as if his body had betrayed a will that remained unbroken. Doctors held out cautious hope. Spinal injuries were unpredictable, they said. Recovery was possible, though far from certain. Patton clung to this possibility. He spoke of rehabilitation, of returning to America, of continuing his work. Friends and family shared this hope, unwilling to imagine that a man who had survived so much could be undone by a roadside accident. But the injury had set forces in motion that could not be reversed. Patton developed pneumonia, a common and deadly complication for patients with high spinal paralysis. His breathing grew labored. Treatments were administered, but his strength waned. The man who had once driven himself relentlessly now lay motionless, dependent on others for every breath. On December 21st, 1945, 12 days after the crash, George S. Patton, Jr. died in the hospital at Heidelberg. He was 60 years old. The official cause of death was pulmonary edema secondary to pneumonia, brought on by the spinal injury sustained in the accident. The war had ended. The general had survived every battlefield. It was peace that had claimed him. The news stunned the military world. Tributes poured in from soldiers who had followed him across continents, from commanders who had argued with him and admired him in equal measure. For many, the manner of his death felt profoundly wrong. A warrior of Patton's stature, they believed, should have fallen in battle, not on a quiet road behind a slow-moving truck. Yet history is rarely shaped by what feels fitting. The road near Mannheim had no banners, no enemy fire, no warning of consequence. It was an ordinary place, crossed by thousands of vehicles before and after that winter morning. In that ordinariness lay its final cruelty. Patton's body was prepared for burial, not in America, as many expected, but in Europe, among the soldiers he had commanded. The decision would carry its own meaning, its own quiet message about where his life had truly belonged. As arrangements were made and winter deepened across Germany, the question lingered, unspoken but heavy, of what it meant for a general who never stopped moving to come to rest far from home, in the land where his last battle had already been fought. George S. Patton did not return home in triumph. There was no grand procession, no cheering crowds lining American streets, no final speech delivered from a reviewing stand. Instead, his journey ended quietly in Europe, far from the country whose wars he had fought and whose armies he had driven forward with relentless force. In death, as in life, Patton became a figure shaped by tension, restraint, and unresolved meaning. In the days after his death on December 21st, 1945, the question of Patton's burial became immediate and symbolic. Many assumed he would be returned to the United States, interred with full honors at Arlington National Cemetery. That was the path expected for a general of his rank and fame. Patton himself had expressed a desire to be buried among his men, a sentiment he had voiced more than once during the war. His family agreed. So did the Army. Patton was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery and Memorial, overlooking the city of Luxembourg. The site held the graves of thousands of American soldiers who had fallen during the Battle of the Bulge and the final campaigns into Germany. There, beneath a simple white cross, Patton was laid to rest. His grave was placed at the head of the cemetery, aligned with the rows behind it, not elevated or isolated. Visitors would see him first, but he would remain part of the formation, just as he had always wanted. The burial was conducted with dignity, but without spectacle. Military honors were rendered, prayers spoken, and then the ceremony ended. The world moved on quickly. The United States was focused on demobilization, on the return of millions of servicemen, on rebuilding lives interrupted by war. The atomic age had begun. New anxieties replaced old ones. Patton's death, though mourned, did not dominate the public consciousness for long. This quiet passing unsettled many who had known him. Patton had been larger than life, a man who thrived on attention, symbolism, and dramatic gesture. He understood the power of ceremony and used it deliberately during the war to inspire fear in enemies and confidence in his troops. That his own end lacked such theater seemed almost cruel. Yet it was also fitting in a way Patton might never have admitted. The world he belonged to had ended, and it did not pause to honor him properly. Almost immediately, rumors began to circulate. Some questioned the simplicity of the accident that had paralyzed him. Whispers of conspiracy surfaced, suggesting that Patton's outspoken views had made him enemies powerful enough to silence him. These theories found fertile ground in the confusion of the early Cold War, when mistrust and secrecy were becoming habits. No evidence ever supported such claims. Investigations found no foul play. The crash was a tragic accident, and Patton's death the result of well-understood medical complications. Still, the persistence of these rumors revealed something deeper. For many, it was hard to accept that a man who had survived artillery barrages and armored warfare could be undone by a mundane collision. War had spared him repeatedly. Peace had not. The randomness of it challenged the idea that history follows dramatic logic or rewards greatness with fitting conclusions. In the years that followed, Patton's reputation continued to evolve. His wartime achievements were studied, his campaigns analyzed in military academies around the world. His emphasis on speed, initiative, and relentless pressure influenced generations of officers. At the same time, his flaws were scrutinized more openly. His temper, his harsh discipline, his insensitive remarks, and his political misjudgments became part of the record. This dual legacy made Patton difficult to categorize. He was neither a simple hero nor a cautionary tale. He embodied the contradictions of modern warfare, where brilliance and brutality often coexist. He was a master of battle who struggled with the moral and political realities that followed victory. In this sense, his final years were a continuation of his lifelong struggle to reconcile action with consequence. For the soldiers who had served under him, Patton's death marked the end of an era. Many veterans spoke of him with a mixture of fear and affection. He had demanded everything from them and given them confidence in return. He had pushed them hard, sometimes too hard, but he had also led from the front, sharing the risks he imposed. That bond did not dissolve with peace or death. Patton's absence also changed the narrative of the war itself. Without him, there was no powerful voice arguing for a harder line against the Soviet Union in the immediate aftermath of victory. History moved in directions he had predicted, but could no longer influence. The Cold War emerged slowly, through diplomacy and proxy conflict rather than the direct confrontation Patton had imagined. Whether his presence would have altered that course remains unknowable. What is clear is that Patton never found a place in the peace he helped create. His skills were forged for decisive action, not compromise. The world after 1945 demanded patience, restraint, and political subtlety. Patton had never believed in half measures. He saw conflict in stark terms and believed that problems unresolved by force would return in more dangerous forms. In that sense, his death froze him in time, preserving him as a figure of war rather than forcing him to adapt to a role he did not want. Today, visitors to the Luxembourg Cemetery often pause at his grave. It stands out not because it is grand, but because of who lies beneath it. The rows behind stretch into the distance, identical markers for men whose names are less known, but whose sacrifices were no less real. Patton rests among them, a general without a parade, a warrior without a final campaign. His life ended quietly, but the questions he raised did not. How should victors behave after war? how much truth can be spoken in times of political necessity, whether brilliance excuses excess. These debates continue long after the last shot is fired. Patton's final battlefield was not a field at all, but the space between memory and judgment. He never came home, not because he was denied the chance, but because the war had claimed him so completely that there was no other place he truly belonged. His story closed not with applause, but with silence. And in that silence, history continues to wrestle with a man who could win battles, but could not outlive the war that made him.